Well, as you know, the church is its most vibrant when everybody's spiritual gifts are activated and celebrated and put into service of the church, when Joy and Verlene are behind the instruments, when Bill is singing. And George, I appreciate you recognizing Melissa's spiritual gift this evening. And you're sending her shopping. That's great. It's important to be good at something and have a way to give back. We appreciate you, Melissa. All right, I better move on quickly. We're in Colossians. We're spending this month in the book of Colossians. It works out pretty well. There are 4 Wednesdays in the month. There are 4 chapters in Colossians. This is going to fall just fine. John and I are sharing the load here. I'm taking chapters 1 and 3. He's taking 2 and 4. So we'll get different voices weighing in, different ways of looking at this wonderful letter. And tonight we jump in with some introduction and the first verses of this book. The big themes that we're going to be tracing across these 4 weeks is this elevated, majestic way that the Christ is presented here in Colossians in an exalted language, unlike what we find in so much of the rest of the New Testament. We're going to be giving time tonight to this verse 15, this hymn in the first chapter, but you see the lofty language, the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and so forth. But the other big theme that we're going to be tracing across these weeks is this is a corrective letter to this congregation because they've gotten off center in their doctrine. And doctrine is important. We talk a lot, we talk more around here about right practice than we do about right doctrine. We talk about missions and going and doing and loving, which is very important. But it is centered in right belief and right doctrine. And so when this church started getting off center and chasing things that were out of bounds for Christian orthodoxy, the author comes in and brings a corrective there. An example here that we'll talk about more next week: see that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit according to human tradition. So before we get to the first chapter, I want to do a little introduction to the book. Colossae, you see, is in what is now modern-day Turkey. It was a trade route when it was a more popular city, particularly for textiles, and there was some purple wool in the region that made it a desirable place to move through in your travels, to pick up the purple wool of that area. But in AD 60, an earthquake destroyed the city, and it never came back to the prominence it had before then. If y'all are familiar with the region, it is near the modern city of Honaz. I have no idea where that city is located, but you'll get a gist that it's in what is modern-day Turkey. Now, the authorship question becomes a little bit tricky, so hang with me. It seems obvious because the first sentence says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. It says, Paul, right? But there has been an ongoing debate about whether or not this was actually penned by Paul. and we're going to spend a little time on this. There's not a lot of shared terminology with letters that are clearly from Paul. Like Galatians and Romans talk about law and righteousness and faith and grace, and those are not themes or words that show up here very often. Paul talks about the Spirit in nearly every Pauline letter, and here it appears twice as just virtually no reference to the Spirit at all. So we've got folks who are adamant on both sides. There is a kind of middle way that I want to talk about too. And to talk about this, I want to brag on my boss. So y'all know I worked at the School of Theology at Mercer for 18 years, and for all 18 years, Alan Culpepper was my dean and my boss, and one of the finest men I have ever known. He went to Southern Seminary, then to Duke for PhD work, and then was hired back to Southern Seminary to teach when he was still, I guess, in his late 20s, I suppose. Had a career at Southern until things collapsed there in the late 80s. He went for just a couple of years to Baylor before he was invited to come be the dean at Mercer. But this, the picture you see is of his PhD thesis, the Johannine School, an evaluation of the Johannine School hypothesis. So at 20-something years old, he did a PhD that advanced this idea, that the early disciples and apostles had schools that were created around them because they were the ones who had been at the feet of Jesus. And so Matthew had a group of folks who hung out with him and walked around and talked and ate and went to places, and they would say, Matthew, tell us more stories about Jesus. Tell us that one again. And John had a group of people who, and these were kind of in different places, but they were learning academies around the folks who had been eyewitnesses to the life and teaching of Jesus. And so, of course, they told the same stories over and over. But some of them told stories some of them didn't tell. And some of them told the stories just a little bit differently. And then as time went on, it is probable that the first gospel is probably Mark, and it was probably written about AD 64. So this oral tradition and these first, these early eyewitnesses are getting old and dying off, and folks say, we got to get this stuff written down. I mean, these folks are getting old and they're dying off, and what if we lose? We've got to write this stuff down. And they write them down, and that becomes the Gospels, right? So Alan Culpepper, in his PhD, advanced the idea of these schools of tradition, and that the Gospel of John would not have been written by John, but it would have been written out of the community of John's learners. That makes sense? So they might have even pointed to the really, really smart one in the group and said, okay, no, they wouldn't have called your name, but they would have called the name of one of the really smart ones in the group. Say, why don't you write it for us? Because you got the language and you, right? So it is the Gospel of John, because it was his teachings, and it came out of his community, but not his pen. Y'all following that argument? Well, This comes out as a PhD thesis when Alan Culpepper is 28 years old or something. And the leading John scholar in the world, I'm drawing a blank on his name, Roman Catholic scholar who wrote all the great commentaries on John. If one of y'all remembers it, call it out. Raymond Brown, thank you. I should have looked to Barbara right off the bat. Raymond Brown is the great Roman Catholic John scholar who read the PhD thesis of young Alan Culpepper and wrote an academic article saying, I have changed my mind about the authorship of John. I'm convinced he made the case. And so, with that kind of celebrity endorsement, Alan Culpepper's stock goes way up and he becomes a junior superstar in the academic circuits because he had turned the head of Raymond Brown as a 28-year-old. All right, all of that to say, that is background for another possibility of authorship that would make this different from other Pauline writings, but that it would say, I, Paul, bring you greetings, right? Because it's being written on behalf of Paul out of the Pauline community that's gathered around him for learning. So, you can pick any one of those you want. I don't have a whole lot of buy-in there. But for shorthand, I'm going to just say Paul. All right, we're just going to say, and when Paul wrote this, Paul said, but I did want you to know that we've got some disagreement in the scholarly world about authorship. It is an occasional letter, sometimes called a particular epistle, and not a general epistle. Who's going to give the answer about the difference between a general epistle and an occasional epistle? I mentioned this in a sermon just recently. Come on. All right, y'all are not paying attention when I'm preaching, and I knew this was a general letter is written as kind of a thesis paper on the topic. And it's a general letter because it's sent to the churches generally with the idea that this is going to go, so Romans is a general letter. It's not about the particulars of a congregation. It's got all this wonderful theology and all of that. And the idea is that this congregation is going to read this copy of Romans and then run it up the road and hand it to another congregation, and they'll read it and they'll run it up the road and hand it to another one. But the particular letters go right at a single congregation's issues. The clearest example of this would be Corinthians, right, where they're just all in a mess. And Paul says, am I going to have to come at you with a stick? I just love that line. Am I going to have to beat this out of you? You know, they're fussing, they're in a mess, and that letter is dealing with their particulars. Well, this is a particular epistle. This is going to this particular church to deal with their specific list of issues. This is also a church Paul did not start and Paul has never been to. And that's going to come up in the first chapter we'll look at in a minute. But there is some evidence in the text that even though it is written for this church at Colossae, they're going to be sharing it with some neighbor churches who might be kind of infected with the same things about angel worship and some of the stuff we'll look at in the coming weeks. Give it to those in Laodicea and all of that. And you can see on the map that those are neighboring communities there. So, enough of that. Let's go to chapter 1. Any questions about any of that confusing authorship intro stuff? One more word to say about it. Part of what has been in the mix about authorship of the Gospels all along is we talk about the intricate beauty of the language, the imagery, the structural integrity. They've got poems in there that do kind of, and then they say, now how did fishermen pull this off, right? Well, this idea of these communities helps answer that question, that if the early disciples are retelling and retelling and retelling the stories of Jesus, that the learned ones in the community stitched those stories together and told the gospel according to Luke, for instance. All right, let's take a look at chapter 1, and I have run off some copies. If there's not enough for everyone, there are copies on some other tables here, but we've got chapter 1 in front of us to take a look at. And notice Paul begins by noting his apostolic credentials in the very first verse. If you thumbed over in the New Testament, the next book to come about is Thessalonians, and Paul doesn't do that when he starts in Thessalonians. Paul's evangelist Timothy to the church at Thessalonians and God the Father, he doesn't declare his status as an apostle. But the idea here is that in this case, he didn't start the church, he doesn't know these people. This is a part of his establishing his credentials for what he's about to lay on them next week in chapter 2 when John teaches. 2 through 14, to the saints and faithful brothers and sisters in Christ, and grace and peace to you. That's a typical beginning for a letter of that time, although Paul's letters tend to extend it a little more than others do. But talk about this a little more in a minute, but notice the setups that are happening here. He is affirming in these early verses this community of faith, because he, in chapter 2, is about to correct them. So in these opening verses, he's saying, y'all are faithful. You're good, and you're my kin, you're my people. And you are beloved, and y'all are just wonderful. And then he's just going to smack them in the next chapter. But he wants to start by saying, you really are, you are giving all you've got to the formation of the church and the faith. Let me go ahead and say this part here. Part of what's happening in these early churches is they don't have anything to rely on, right? They don't have a Bible. They don't have any church history. They don't have books of theology. They don't have any norms of orthodoxy. It's just what folks said. And if somebody comes in the church and is more persuasive than the last person who came, that'd be all right. So everything's kind of in flux and forming, and theology hasn't gotten its boundaries yet. And so he's affirming that y'all are faithful people, and you're showing up to church, and you're giving to the poor, and you're doing. But in chapter 2, he's going to slap them around a little bit. I put this picture of parchment just as a reminder that this would have likely have been the vehicle by which this was passed on in that century. More examples of this affirmation to the gathered church. The saints and faithful brothers and sisters, we give thanks for you. You've been bearing fruit. Y'all are great until chapter 2, but y'all are great in chapter 1. It mentions another early church leader in verse 7. This is a Gentile believer from the area, and apparently ends up in prison with Paul at some point, because when Paul writes the letter to Philemon, he mentions that this Christian leader is with him in prison. So this was one of the saints in the area that they both know, and it's kind of a way of saying, again, in this first chapter, Paul's introducing himself because he doesn't know these people, but we've got mutual friends, and Jim and Becky will vouch for me, right? I did that when I was at the Baptist World Alliance this summer, and I didn't know any of these people, and I just say, yeah, but I know Jim and Becky Smith, and they go, oh, sit down, come here, right? So this is a little bit of that. We've got mutual friends. All right. So in verse 15, we start the great Christ hymn of this of the first chapter. So the two things Paul is doing in this first chapter is introducing himself, but the book is about countering false teachers and false doctrine. So right off the bat, he comes out with this elevated hymn about the supremacy of Christ. Jesus is the before all, in all, bigger than anything. We've got to establish who Jesus is before we can deal with these ways you have started getting off course in chapter 2. And so he begins with what probably has become a hymn of the early church. And let me read it to you beginning in verse 15 so that you can hear the elevated language of this Christ hymn. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. See this majestic kind of Christ. Mentioned it was probably a hymn of the early church, and it has informed our hymns, lots of them. These high, lifted up ways of talking about Jesus in the church. And so I have asked Bill and Joy to bring us 3 verses of one of them, but I want you to take an assignment on this too. So look at verse 15 through 20 as Bill sings, "Sing praise to God who reigns above," and listen for the influence and the overlap of how this hymn probably just emerged right out of this ancient hymn as a part of our current hymnody. So I'm not doing the music part. I'm stepping aside.
Those of you who are familiar with this hymn know that it has 5 verses, but the end of each verse has a brief doxology. And if you know what doxology means, it's a phrase of praise to God. I know many of you know this doxology at the end of each line, so I invite you to sing with me, "To God all praise and glory." I'll sing verses 1, 2, and 5. Sing praise to God who reigns above, the God of all creation, the God of power, the God of love, the God of our salvation. With healing balm my soul he fills, and every faithless murmur stills. To God all praise and glory. What God's almighty power has made, in mercy he is keeping. By morning glow or evening shade, his eye is never sleeping. Within the kingdom of his might, lo, all is just and all is right. To God all praise and glory. Let all who name Christ's holy name give God all praise and glory. Let all who know his power proclaim aloud the wondrous story. Cast each false idol from its throne, for Christ is Lord, and Christ alone. To God all praise and glory. Amen.
Well, thank you both. Did you see it? Did you follow along and catch not only the notes of that, but there were words and phrases that pulled straight out of this early church exaltation. After this grand vision of the cosmic Christ over all of creation, there is a move to talk about how this ministry of Jesus pertains to them. And so in 21 through 23, you see it becomes, it kind of moves from the cosmic to the personal. You once were, now you are. You once were estranged, hostile in mind, doing evil deeds. You're now reconciled. Hope promised by the gospel. So it's becoming personal to those who are meeting there. And then in the last section of this chapter, Paul shifts to talking about himself and his ministry and his reason for writing. As we said, next week he's going to John's going to get into this reasoned appeal against the false teachings. But this first chapter is so that Paul sets up his credentials and the supremacy and primacy of Christ. And he's trying to say that this is not, I'm legit. I've got credentials. This isn't born of my arrogance, what I'm about to talk about. I have been through it, suffering for the cause of Christ. And he talks about his imprisonment. He talks about what he's been through as an apostle to further legitimize himself. and then ends this appeal, establishing his credentials by explaining clearly what his motivations are for what he's about to get into when he calls them to task. And his motivation is that we may present everyone mature in Christ. Because there's no way for us to be mature in Christ if we're learning in a false doctrine in a way that's going to move us away from the supremacy of Jesus. And so, to summarize, he affirms them in this first chapter. Then he soars with the language of the primacy of Christ and establishes his credentials before he turns to talking about the false teachers that they're listening to, the worship of angels and all the other things that have gotten them, Gnosticism and all that's gotten them so far afield, away from good doctrine where they needed to be. So, any questions about chapter 1? Yeah.
Chapter 15, where it says, firstborn of all creation. I thought God was always there. He was never born.
I think it is a statement of primacy more than it's a statement of birth, right? Not the first to be born as much as the firstborn of all creation, right? Would be how I would read that, not as a physical birth, but as a way of saying he was there in the beginning. Yeah, it would be. Yeah. Other thoughts or ideas here? Right.
Is that just Paul felt like that was his role and that was a common thing he did?
Yeah, Aaron's asking for those online. It seems kind of audacious to just write a group of people you don't even know. So did Paul see this as his role? And the short answer is yes, because. Back to what I was saying earlier, the early church was so fragile in its doctrinal integrity because they had nothing to appeal to. It's all of this oral tradition, and there's no church constitution and bylaws, and there's no Nicene Creed, and there's no... And so the urgency, the importance of this first century movement, those in Paul's position of authority and understanding do kind of treat it like, yeah, this is my job. I've got to go in and correct it. Not unlike maybe a bishop would show up at a church he had never been to enforce and make things right, because I have the authority as a representative of the church to come do that. And it is audacious, right? Which is a part of why this first chapter goes so overboard to say, I'm an apostle, I have suffered, I've been in prison, I've earned the right to do what I'm about to do.
He's not a humble servant.
John is saying that Paul is an audacious personality anyway. This is true. He's not bashful about speaking his mind on.
Look what he did to the Corinthians.
Yeah. A friend of mine described Corinthians as a middle school food fight, and that's about right. And Paul just he just lets them have it. That one's a little different though, because that one was his. Those were his people. But yeah.
With this church, would they know about Paul? Would they know of him?
Yes, they would have known. That's a great question. John's asking, would they have known about Paul? And yes, Paul's reputation in the early church and in the region would have preceded, and they would have known who he was. And part of that is this transmission of letter. That's the only way the doctrine kind of got stitched together, were these letters by the church founders who were correcting and explaining, and so they would have known about Paul and his letters and his writings and his reputation. Yeah. Yes.
One of the trickiest little sect groups I ever had to deal with in Europe, they kind of took off on verse 16, and they made a big thing about that second part of it, really about for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. And there was a teacher that was circulating around Austria that was talking about, he knew all of these powers and authorities and the spiritual realm kind of things, and so he was telling everyone else, the real, the undiluted juice,
Ooh.
and the rest of us, including missionaries, pastors, elders, or whatever, were, we were just on the surface. And in fact, when I asked to attend one of the lectures and teachings, I remember I was told that I was not spiritually mature enough
Mm.
to be able to participate in such a high round of revelation.
That's an interesting parallel to where this is going next week and the next. Jim was saying that somebody, when he was in Austria, had misused verse 16 to declare kind of his own power in the system, that God had made him a ruler and who has dominion over others, so sit down and listen to me. And Jim was obviously not spiritually mature enough to be in his presence. But really, his experience in Austria is akin to what we're going to be looking at the next couple of weeks, because you've got different traveling teachers coming through the congregations with different teachings and claiming authority. And this is the way it is. And so that's why Paul kind of pulls out his trump card to say, I'm an apostle, so you kind of have to listen to me about this and not them. And it's about Jesus. The high exalted Christ that's the starting point. It's not, there is a parallel. Other observations or questions?
And if anybody knew how Paul was before Damascus, the road to Damascus, and then after Damascus, they really would listen to him.
Yeah, you would think. And yeah, the question is, the statement was if they'd known who he was before Damascus and after, they certainly would have listened to him. And I don't know, I mean, they would have known that he was a respected church leader. I don't know how much of their story, of his story, they would have known. I don't know if the whole, yeah, if he'd gotten in front of them, he'd have let them know, that's for sure. Yeah.
I always think it's interesting that Paul always seems to lump himself in with the disciples that were with Jesus because he saw Jesus on the Damascus Road.
That's right. That's John's mentioning an interesting debate that Paul lumps himself in with the disciples who saw Jesus, the apostles, because they were following him around. But Paul, because of his Damascus Road encounter with Jesus, counts himself among the apostles and is not bashful about declaring his apostolic credentials. Yeah. It's interesting. I look back, I mentioned that in Thessalonians, he did not start off by saying he was an apostle. I look back at Corinthians, and he does in the intro of Corinthians, even though it's his church, they're his people. But because he's about to slap them around too, he goes ahead and starts off by saying, I'm an apostle. I get to do this. Well, we get to the fight next week. John gets the good part. He gets the wrestling part. Chapter 2, read ahead next week. Come with hard questions on weeks 2 and 4. Go in peace. We'll see you Sunday.